Now, let me introduce to you a colleague who I think someday will be known as a special kind of founder of critical thinking, a founder in the sense that Socrates was the founder. Socrates was the founder of critical thinking, not because he advanced the theory of critical thinking, but because he modeled it continually. If you were brought into contact with Socrates, all he did was ask questions. But his questions were unrelenting and kept probing deeper and deeper and deeper. And one of the masters of that art is the gentleman who will now replace me here, and that is Gerald Nosich.
Good morning.
Morning.
Those of you who've seen me or have heard me before know I have difficulty standing in one place when I talk. But I also move my hands when I talk, so I can't use this because whenever I move my arms, you will not be able to hear. So I want to talk to you a little bit about my personal story in relation to critical thinking, just some pieces of it. In a way, I got started in critical thinking because in relation to my teaching, because I discovered early on that I was not teaching my students to think. I was not teaching my students to think much at all. And I came up in a philosophy department, and I taught in a philosophy department, and you may not know this, but people in philosophy are kind of tend to be kind of arrogant when it comes to thinking. Not all, of course, but we kind of think of it as our turf. Truth thinking is our turf. And so I just discovered, but it took me about 4 or 5 years, that I was not appreciably teaching my students to think well at all. And it took a long time. That's very enlightening to me, because I would give my students essay exams on what we worked on in the course, and their essay exams would be great. They'd be showing excellent thinking very much of the time, and I'd be very impressed with them, and I'd give good grades, bad grades, all in the middle. So it took me a long time to discover that they weren't really thinking out. The thinking that was there on the page was my thinking. And so I liked it very much. I thought it was really well done. But the discovery, the thing that hit me, is when I found out that if I gave my students a different question, one we had not addressed directly in class, but one that was like ones we addressed in class, my students were really no better at thinking through it after taking my course than they were before. Now, it was just really a shock to me. And it happened several times. And so I realized that what they did is they just went back to the ways of thinking they came into my course with, and my course had no appreciable effect, even during the course. I'm not even speaking about 6 months later, during the course itself. So I stepped back from the philosophy, and I decided to work on how can I help my students learn to think better? What can I do about that? And so I wrote a book on it, and I thought it was a good book, and I could say I think it is a good book. But what I didn't know, again, it took me many years to realize this, is that the book I wrote, the way I did it, was heavily enmeshed in my discipline. I can tell you that when I boiled it down a little bit later, it came out like this, just kind of maybe 4 steps. What does it mean? Is it true? If it's true, so what? And what alternatives are there? So it's not a bad system. It's not a bad system at all. But what I didn't realize, because I was so entrenched in my discipline and my ways of thinking and the rightness of it, that with this background story I had about thinking, is that this is a model that's heavily entrenched in philosophical type discourse. So I was once introduced as one of the fathers of informal logic, and I thought, oh, that's nice. But But in the 80s, I began realizing that this was a very limited model. One thing that helped is coming to this conference. When I came to this conference after my book was published, I came to the conference because Richard was using my textbook as one of the textbooks in his courses, and so he invited me to the conference, and that was the first time I actually heard the term critical thinking. I'm not aware of ever having heard of it before that. But then I got all these new ideas at the conference. Many of them came from Richard, and there's a way in which it's hard for me to describe both the impact and the lack of impact they had on me. For instance, he said he had this idea of the intellectual traits, the intellectual virtues, way back then. This is early 1980s. And there are traits like intellectual courage, intellectual humility, intellectual perseverance, fair-mindedness. And I heard those, and I mentioned here, they don't fit into what it is I did. Right? And mine was, what does it mean? Is it true? What follows? And what alternatives are there? Where does intellectual courage fit in? And so I did what you do when you find these things that don't fit into the scheme, to the model you have of how to do things. I ignored them. I pushed them off to the side of my mind. And but I worked with Richard a lot, and I managed to continue to not ignore them, but I ignored them less and less over time. But in the 80s, I became convinced that critical thinking couldn't be just its own thing, couldn't be its own course, couldn't even be a series of courses devoted to critical thinking, and it certainly couldn't be the kind of model I'm addressing, that I had been addressing. And the key item for me there, one of them, maybe I'm exaggerating it, but one of the key items for me there was coming in contact with nurses. I worked several times with schools of nursing, and I would use my model. So think about nursing for a minute. There's just a very close knit between critical thinking and nursing. Right? If there's anything you want a nurse to be, it's an informed, reasonable decision maker. Right? So the reasonable is an essential part of nursing, but one of the problems, or one of the weights nursing carries, is this enormous body of information. Well, it's not as if what you want a student nurse to learn to do is to ask, what does it mean? Is it true? So what? And what alternatives are there? It's not as if you want them to take an argument and pull it apart into its component parts. They're not out after arguments. They're after understanding, application, thinking of complications of the problems that might arise, dealing with actual people, having intellectual courage, intellectual humility, intellectual perseverance. And so I was just stunned by how this model that I thought fit everything didn't fit nursing. And then I went around other fields and I realized it didn't fit very many fields at all. It was a part of all fields, but it's not the centerpiece of all fields. And that's what opened me up very much to the power of the elements of reason, the elements of thinking and the standards, because one of the things about those is that they fit all our fields. Nursing, as well as philosophy, as well as natural sciences and social sciences, the professions and office, how I deal with my family. In all of those, I have purposes, I'm making assumptions, there are conclusions I'm drawing, I'm using concepts. The elements of reasoning and the standards of reasoning were the big influence in shifting me over to a way of doing critical thinking across the curriculum. One that encompasses the model I had before, but is eminently larger and more flexible. And that's the model you're going to be working with over the next few days. And I think that's a little bit about the history of that model.